The woods of Milbrook County were silent that October morning. Too silent. Not a bird sang, not a leaf moved. Sheriff Coleman had seen murder scenes before, but never this. Hanging from the trees were 3 small bodies, swaying gently in the wind. At first, they looked like children. Then you saw it. Where their feet should have been were hands. Perfect, 5-fingered hands, tied by the wrists to the branches above. These weren't murder victims. They were something worse, something that should not exist. When investigators traced them back to the isolated Blessed family compound, what they uncovered was a nightmare 150 years in the making. 7 generations of carefully planned, holy marriages, a breeding program designed to create something no longer fully human. And what waited in the basement of that compound would change everything we thought we knew about faith, genetics, and the very future of humanity. If this story already has you leaning closer to the screen, hit like and subscribe. It helps this channel dive deeper into the most unsettling real-world mysteries. And share this with a friend who loves dark, cinematic investigations. Because what's coming next is something you'll want to discuss when the lights go out. The October wind cut through the pines like a warning, carrying a smell that didn't belong in any forest. Sheriff Coleman had been to countless crime scenes, but this was different, heavier, almost intelligent. His deputy, Mike, stood near the tree line, face pale, hand shaking as he pointed toward the clearing. "You better see this," he said, voice tight. Even the insects had gone quiet, as if holding their breath. Coleman ducked under the police tape, boots crunching through dead leaves. The stench grew sharper, like sweet rot mixed with copper. Something primal inside him screamed to turn back, but he kept walking. The clearing opened, and there they were. 3 small figures hung upside down from thick branches, swaying in the wind. Coleman's heart slammed against his ribs. At first glance, they looked like boys. Then he saw their feet. No, not feet. Hands. Perfect, 5-fingered hands, pale and delicate, tied by their wrists to the branches above. Coleman stopped cold. The sight clawed at every instinct he had about how the world should work. Mike gagged behind him, bent over and vomiting into the leaves. "What kind of sick freak does this?" he whispered, wiping his mouth. Coleman said nothing, too busy fighting the urge to draw his weapon. He forced himself forward, scanning the clearing. The boys were small, maybe 4 or 5 years old by the size of their torsos. Their normal hands hung limp, but those foot hands were locked open, fingers spread. Coleman reached up and touched one of the ropes. It was old farm rope, rough and cutting into the skin. The flesh was swollen, but not decayed. These boys hadn't been dead long. Then one of the boys twitched. Coleman froze, thinking he imagined it. But no. The hand at the end of his leg flexed, the fingers curling as if reaching for the ground. "They're alive," Coleman breathed. He ripped the radio from his belt and called for an ambulance. Mike was already running to the truck to grab the medical kit. The forest felt tighter now, as if watching. Coleman cut the first boy down carefully, laying him on the grass. His skin was cold, but not lifeless. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. Coleman brushed dirt from his face, whispering, "Stay with me." The boy's eyes fluttered open. Pure white, no pupils. His mouth moved, and a voice came out, too deep for his small frame. "7th are cursed," he rasped. "Below. They're all below." Coleman's blood ran cold. He wanted to ask questions, but the boy's eyes rolled back and he went limp again. Behind him, Mike cursed softly, struggling to untie the second child without snapping his fingers. They got all 3 down and laid them side by side. Coleman checked each pulse, all faint but steady. The third boy's breathing was barely there, but he opened his mouth and spoke one word. "Roots," he said. "Roots are wrong." Then he convulsed, his foot hands clenching into fists. Coleman and Mike held him until the seizure passed, then wrapped him in a blanket from the truck. Sirens wailed in the distance, the ambulance finally breaking the silence. Coleman stood guard over the three boys, scanning the tree line. The forest felt wrong now, heavier, like it was holding something back. When the paramedics arrived, they froze at the sight. One of them swore under his breath before kneeling to check vitals. "They're still alive," Coleman said, "but I don't know for how long." The paramedics worked quickly, strapping the boys onto stretchers. As they lifted the smallest one, his hand-foot twitched again, brushing against the dirt. Coleman saw dark lines scarred into its palm. He crouched closer. The marks weren't random, they were symbols, deliberate and old. Not letters he recognized, more like roots, spirals, and branching veins carved deep into the skin and long since healed. "What the hell happened to these kids?" Mike muttered, staring. Coleman shook his head. "No clue, but we're going to find out." He glanced toward the distant hills where the Blessed Family compound waited. Everyone in Milbrook knew about the Blessed Family, a reclusive religious group that kept to themselves behind tall wooden walls. Coleman had been sheriff 30 years and never once been invited inside. The locals called them holy men, but there were whispers about strange marriages, odd births, children who never came to school. Coleman had dismissed most of it as gossip, until now. The ambulance doors slammed shut, taking the boys toward the hospital. Coleman stayed behind, staring at the ropes dangling from the branches. He noticed something he'd missed before. The bark itself was wrong. Up close, the tree's surface looked like faces. Not carved, but grown, as if the wood had twisted itself into screaming shapes over decades. Coleman stepped back, fighting the chill crawling up his spine. The wind shifted, carrying a low hum. Not an animal sound, not the wind. Something deeper, like the earth itself was vibrating. Mike looked around, eyes wide. "You hear that?" Coleman nodded grimly. "We're not done here," he said. "Mark the site. We're coming back." He turned toward the truck, already calling for state police backup and federal assistance. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a local case. As they drove away, Coleman glanced in the rearview mirror. For a second, he swore he saw movement in the trees, dozens of small shapes slipping back into the shadows, watching them leave. Mike saw it too. "Sheriff," he said, voice tight, "how many kids you think they got in there?" Coleman didn't answer right away. His hands tightened on the wheel. "More than we can handle alone." They reached the road, tires spitting gravel. Coleman grabbed his radio again. "Get me state investigators, get me CDC, and get me anyone who knows something about genetic mutations. We're going to need all of them." The sky above Milbrook was darkening early, clouds boiling against the wind. Coleman felt the weight of something coming, something he couldn't stop yet. But he could prepare. The forest wasn't done with them, and neither was whatever lived beneath it. The wooden gates loomed like a fortress, 12 feet high and reinforced with iron. Coleman stood in front of them, shotgun in hand, the smell of smoke and rot leaking through the cracks like a warning. Federal agents moved into position, rifles ready, their boots crunching on gravel. No birds sang here, no wind touched the walls. It was as if the entire forest bent away from this place. Mike parked the cruiser and joined Coleman, sweat running down his temple despite the chill. "You really think they'll let us in?" Coleman shook his head. "Doesn't matter. We're not asking this time." He signaled, and the battering ram went to work. The first hit splintered the wood. The second forced it open. By the third, the gate swung wide, revealing the courtyard beyond. The smell hit them full force, sweet and chemical, like something had been preserved for too long. Several agents gagged. Coleman covered his face with his sleeve and pushed forward. "Clear every building, find the kids." The compound was eerily quiet, buildings standing like mute witnesses. The agents fanned out, entering cabins, sheds, barns. Coleman headed for the main hall, the largest structure, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was heavy. as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. Rows of bunk beds lined the walls, each one neatly made. Coleman's flashlight beam revealed clothing laid out in perfect stacks. He moved deeper, finding strange carvings etched into the floor. Spirals, roots, geometric shapes that seemed to move when his light passed over them. His skin crawled. "Mike, get photos. All of this." A sound came from the back room. Low, rhythmic breathing, too many breaths at once. Coleman drew his pistol and pushed the door open. What he saw made his stomach lurch. Dozens of boys sat cross-legged on the floor, perfectly still. Each one had hand-feet like the three in the woods. Their heads turned toward him in eerie unison, eyes white and glowing faintly. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the oldest boy, maybe 16, stood up. His voice carried like a chorus. "You found the hung ones," he said calmly. "You've broken the silence." Coleman swallowed hard. "Where are the men in charge here?" The boy smiled faintly, though the expression never reached his strange, glowing eyes. "Below," he said. "They're all below. We are what remains above." Mike's hand trembled as he radioed for medical teams. Coleman holstered his weapon but kept one hand near it. "We need to get these kids out of here," he said. "Every last one." The boy shook his head slowly. "Take us if you wish, but the pattern is not broken. The root has many branches and the branches grow back." His words sounded rehearsed, ritualistic. Agents began ushering the boys toward the courtyard. Some resisted, gripping the floor with their hand-feet, leaving glowing prints on the wood. Coleman barked at his men. "Do not harm them! Move slow!" Outside, more boys were found, in barns, sheds, even up in the rafters. By the time they were gathered, there were 43 of them, ranging from toddlers to nearly grown men. Coleman walked through them, counting, noting their strange stillness. None cried. None spoke except the first one. They all just watched him with those glowing white eyes, and he felt suddenly very small. Medical tents were erected in the courtyard, and the boys were given blankets, food, water. Coleman paced like a caged animal, waiting for the all-clear from the agent sweeping the rest of the compound. When the last building was cleared, one of the federal men approached, his face pale under his helmet. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "you need to see the chapel. We found something." Coleman followed him to the center of the compound, where the chapel stood, smaller than the hall but older, the wood darker, polished by generations of hands. Its door was open, inviting, and wrong. Inside, Coleman's breath caught. Every wall was covered with charts, hand-drawn genealogies stretching back over a century. Names repeated, looping back, brothers joined to cousins, fathers to sons. The family tree wasn't a tree. It was a knot. Pinned to the altar was a fresh chart, a new generation's names written in careful ink. Coleman counted 49. His stomach dropped. "There are only 43 here," he muttered. "Where are the other 6? The agent beside him shook his head. "We didn't find any bodies, just this." He pointed to the trapdoor behind the altar, heavy and iron-bolted. Something scratched faintly from beneath it, rhythmic, like breathing. Coleman knelt, pressing his ear to the wood. The sound vibrated through his skull, a deep, pulsing rhythm that wasn't quite a heartbeat. He stepped back quickly. "Get this door open," he ordered. As men worked on the bolts, Coleman noticed symbols carved into the door's surface, the same spirals and roots as before, but here they were deeper, as if carved with fanatic precision over many years. Mike joined him, face drawn. "What do you think's down there?" Coleman didn't answer. The last bolt came free, and the heavy door creaked open, releasing a wave of air so foul it burned their throats. The stairs descended into pure blackness. Coleman's flashlight barely penetrated it. The smell was stronger now, metallic and rotten, mixed with something chemical. "Ventilators," he barked. "No one goes down without masks." The first agents descended cautiously. rifles raised. Coleman waited at the top, heart hammering, until the radio crackled. "Sheriff," a voice came through, tight with fear. "You need to see this yourself." Coleman descended, boots thudding on stone. The walls were damp, carved with those same symbols. The deeper he went, the louder the sound became. Not just breathing now, but whispering, hundreds of voices overlapping. When he reached the bottom, his light fell on row after row of cocoons, translucent and glistening, lining the walls like grotesque artwork. Inside them were men, their faces frozen in silent screams. Some were barely changed, others warped beyond recognition, limbs bent, spines twisted, extra joints forming. But all of them were alive. Coleman saw their chests rising, their eyes flicking toward him, following his every move. Mike stumbled back, swearing under his breath. "What is this place?" Coleman forced himself forward, scanning the chamber. Threads connected each cocoon to the center of the room, where something massive pulsed faintly in the dark. He raised his light, and what it revealed made him grip the wall to stay upright. It was a growth of flesh, vast and cylindrical, covered in eyes, mouths, and hands that moved independently. The mouths whispered in unison, a sound that vibrated in Coleman's bones. Words formed slowly, impossibly. "7 complete," it said. "7 must rise. The root is ready. The garden waits." Coleman stumbled back toward the stairs, bile rising in his throat. This wasn't a crime scene. This was something else, something older, patient and hungry. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished yet. He climbed back to the surface, gasping for air as he emerged into the light. The boys were waiting for him, standing in a perfect circle, their glowing eyes turned toward the chapel. The oldest one spoke again, his voice carrying over the courtyard. "You went below," he said. "Now you understand. The 7th generation is complete. The 8th waits to be born." Coleman looked at the boy, then at the chapel, then at the horizon where storm clouds gathered. The whole compound seemed to be holding its breath. Something terrible was coming, and he had just opened the door. Coleman gripped the railing as he descended again, this time with full gear, respirator secure, rifle slung across his chest. The air grew colder with every step, heavy with moisture and something far older. Mike followed close, flashlight cutting thin lines of light through the blackness. "Feels like we're walking into a grave," he muttered, voice muffled through the mask. Coleman didn't reply. It was worse than a grave. At the bottom, the chamber opened wide, more enormous than he'd realized before. The cocoons lined the walls in perfect symmetry, hundreds of them, some glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The whispering never stopped. Coleman stepped forward slowly, scanning the room. The faces inside the cocoons followed his movements, eyes rolling beneath translucent lids. None spoke, but the whispering rose in volume, merging into a single, unified chant. The words were not English, not any language Coleman knew, but he felt their meaning like a hammer in his chest. They spoke of completion, of preparation, of something waiting to emerge. Mike knelt near one of the cocoons, shining his light through the membrane. The man inside stared back, eyes impossibly wide, mouth opening soundlessly as though pleading. "He's alive," Mike said, horrified. Coleman nodded grimly. "They all are." He turned toward the center of the chamber, where the mass of tissue pulsed like a gigantic heart. Veins and threads spread from it to every cocoon. He approached slowly, feeling the floor tremble beneath his boots. The thing was alive, aware. Its dozens of eyes blinked in slow unison. Its mouths moved together, forming new words, this time clear enough to understand. "You are late," it said, voice resonating through the chamber. "7 generations we have waited. The harvest is ready. The roots are deep. You cannot stop the garden from growing." Coleman's hands tightened on his rifle. "What are you?" he demanded. The thing shuddered, eyes and mouths shifting into a grotesque imitation of a human face. "I am the first," it whispered. "I am the root." Mike took a step back, nearly tripping over a thread that pulsed faintly beneath his foot. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "this isn't just some freak accident. This thing's running all of them like puppets." Coleman scanned the walls again. The men inside the cocoons began to twitch, their fingers pressing against the translucent material, their hand-feet flexing as if preparing to break free. Time was running short. He keyed his radio. "We need backup down here. Bring thermite. Bring everything you've got." His voice was tight. "We're going to have to burn this whole place before it spreads any further." Mike's flashlight beam caught something carved into the far wall. A massive symbol, deep and jagged, painted with what looked like dried blood. Spirals within spirals, branching shapes radiating from a central point. Coleman approached it slowly, recognizing it from the boy's foot scars and the carvings on the trap door. This was the pattern they kept talking about, the design they'd spent generations perfecting. As he stared, his vision blurred. The symbol seemed to spin, pulling him in. He saw flashes, men building the compound, fathers standing over sons, boys with hand-feet running through the woods at night. Then he saw the future, the forest overrun, entire towns crawling with these things, men sprouting extra limbs, their faces splitting into many-eyed horrors. He staggered back, ripping his mask away to gasp air. Mike grabbed him. "You okay?" Coleman nodded, though his heart was hammering. "We can't let this continue," he said. "Whatever this is, it ends here." He turned toward the central mass. The thing's mouths twisted into a smile. "You think fire will save you?" it asked. "We are already in your blood. The 7th generation walks above. The 8th grows. Burn the root, the branches remain." Coleman raised his rifle and fired, bullets tearing into the pulsing mass. Thick fluid sprayed, hissing where it hit the floor. The whispering stopped for a moment, replaced by a single shriek that rattled the chamber. The cocoons shook violently. Several split open, spilling their occupants onto the floor. The men who emerged were not fully human, their limbs too long, their bones bent in impossible ways, their hand-feet clawing. Mike opened fire, the narrow space echoing with gunshots. The creatures moved fast, climbing the walls like spiders, their white eyes shining in the beam of the flashlights. Coleman reloaded, firing into the nearest one. It dropped, twitching, but did not die quietly. Its mouth opened, releasing a sound like grinding stone. More cocoons tore open. The chamber was filling with moving bodies, crawling toward them from every direction. Coleman grabbed Mike and dragged him toward the stairs. "Fall back," he shouted into the radio. "Seal the trapdoor. Get the charges ready. We're collapsing this place before any more of them get out." They sprinted up the steps, the sound of pursuit close behind. The things were fast, climbing along walls and ceilings, their hand-feet clinging to stone as though magnetized. Coleman slammed the trapdoor shut behind them. Agents rushed to bar it, bolting it closed and stacking crates over it. Something slammed against it from below, shaking the floorboards. "Get those charges planted!" Coleman barked. "We don't have time!" Outside, the sky had turned an unnatural shade, storm clouds churning overhead. The boys stood in the courtyard, watching silently. Their glowing eyes flickered in unison, as though connected to what was happening below. Coleman walked toward them, chest heaving. "Whatever's down there," he said, voice hard, "we're ending it tonight." The oldest boy tilted his head slightly, almost pitying. "You cannot end what was meant to rise." Mike cursed under his breath. "These kids aren't scared at all." Coleman glanced back at the chapel, then at the darkening sky. "They're not scared because they think they've already won." The sound beneath the floor was growing louder, pounding like a giant heartbeat. The agents worked quickly, planting thermite charges around the perimeter, wiring them to a single detonator. Coleman watched, jaw set like stone. When the last charge was armed, he took the detonator himself. "Get everyone clear," he ordered. The courtyard emptied, except for the boys who remained in their circle, watching him with unnerving calm. Coleman held the detonator in both hands. "Whatever you are," he said under his breath, "this ends now." He pressed the button. The world erupted, fire roaring up from the ground as the chapel exploded. The blast lit the night sky, heat washing over them. The compound shuddered as the underground chambers collapsed, stone grinding against stone. The screams from below were deafening, then cut off abruptly. Smoke poured from the ruined chapel, glowing with strange colors. Coleman stared into the flames, breathing hard. "It's done," he said, though a cold voice inside him whispered that it wasn't over. Not yet. The oldest boy finally spoke again, breaking the silence. "The root may burn," he said softly, "but the seed remains. The eighth waits. You will see." Then he closed his eyes, as if in prayer. Coleman turned away, refusing to answer. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of burning flesh across the courtyard. He knew the fight wasn't over. This was just the first strike in a much larger war. Coleman stood at the edge of the smoldering ruins, smoke curling skyward, carrying the stench of burned flesh and stone. He didn't feel victory. The ground still pulsed faintly under his boots, like something breathing. Mike approached, face streaked with soot. "We got it all," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Coleman shook his head. "We got the basement. That thing had more reach than just one room. Federal agents moved through the compound, collecting the surviving boys and transporting them to secure locations. Their white eyes glowed faintly even in daylight, watching everything but speaking little. Coleman couldn't shake the sense they were waiting. Later, in a temporary operations tent, Coleman stared at the salvaged genealogical charts laid out on a table. Lines and symbols crossed back and forth, creating a pattern that looked less like family history and more like an equation. Dr. Marcus, the geneticist flown in from Philadelphia, stood beside him, studying the records with grim fascination. "This isn't random inbreeding," he said. "This is selective. Generations planned like a breeding program. They were refining something." Coleman looked at him sharply. "Refining what?" Marcus tapped one of the charts. "Markers. Genetic combinations. Each generation is closer to whatever they were trying to create. By the 7th, they reached full expression. Those boys you found." Mike leaned over the table, tracing one of the branching lines with his finger. "So this whole family's been working towards something for over a century, and we just blew it to hell?" Marcus shook his head. "You destroyed their incubator. But look here." He pointed to the last line on the chart. Generation 8. "These names are placeholders. The next stage hadn't been born yet, but they were ready." Coleman's stomach turned. "So they weren't just living down there. They were preparing for the next step." Marcus nodded grimly. "And whatever it wasn't going to stay in this compound." They pored over the records for hours. The first generation showed no mutations, just names and notes about dreams, visions, strange seizures. The second generation displayed longer limbs, extra joints. The third began to show cranial differences. Marcus explained as he traced the pages. "It's progressive. Each generation shows more adaptation, sensory expansion, altered bone structure, neural changes. By the 6th generation, they were producing offspring with radically different brain architecture." Coleman rubbed his temples. "And the 7th?" Marcus glanced at him. "The 7th are perfect conduits, not just carriers of the genetics, carriers of thought. They can channel that thing in the basement directly." Mike shivered. "So you're saying those kids are basically antennas for whatever that thing was?" Marcus nodded. "Receivers and transmitters both. They don't just hear it. They let it think through them." Coleman slammed a fist onto the table. "Then we take them out, every last one. Marcus hesitated. Killing them might trigger something worse. If they're linked, the death of one could activate the others. We need to study them first. Coleman hated it, but he knew Marcus was right. Fine, but we keep them under lock and key. No one goes near them without clearance. He turned back to the smoldering chapel. And we watched that crater. Night fell, and Coleman found himself unable to sleep. He sat near the compound's perimeter, shotgun across his knees, staring into the darkness. The forest was alive with whispers, though no wind stirred the trees. From somewhere deep in the woods, a chorus of voices rose. Not human voices, but something older, resonant, vibrating in his bones. Mike joined him, pale-faced. "Tell me you hear that?" Coleman nodded grimly. "It's not over," Coleman said. "Whatever we burned down there, its mind is still out here, maybe everywhere." The voices faded, leaving a silence even heavier than before, as if the forest had swallowed its own sound. Morning brought new horrors. Agents reported that several of the cocoons had been missing from the rubble. Tracks led away from the site, hand-feet prints glowing faintly in the dirt, heading deeper into the woods. Coleman ordered search teams immediately, but the prints vanished after a mile, as though the creatures had simply climbed into the trees and disappeared. Marcus studied the soil and shook his head. "They're still moving, probably watching us." Back at the tents, Coleman found Marcus sketching something on a notepad. Strange symbols filled the page, copied from the walls below. "What do these mean?" Coleman asked. Marcus glanced up, eyes hollow. "Instructions." Coleman's blood chilled. "Instructions for what?" Marcus hesitated. "For what's next? These aren't just symbols. They're formulas, biological, genetic. The thing was leaving them a blueprint for the next generation." Mike swore under his breath. "So even if we killed it, they've still got its plan." Marcus nodded. "And those boys know it by heart. You saw how they moved. They're linked." Coleman lit a cigarette, staring toward the compound's smoking remains. "Then we break the link, however we have to. If they're the key to this whole nightmare, we take the key out of the lock." That night, Coleman visited the medical tent where the boys were being held. They sat silently, perfectly still, staring at him with those unblinking white eyes. He felt a weight in his chest as he entered. "You think we're prisoners?" the oldest boy said suddenly, his voice low and calm. "But you are. You've stepped into the pattern. The moment you went below, you became part of it." Coleman didn't respond, but his grip on the shotgun tightened. "We're going to stop this," he said. The boy smiled faintly. "You can't stop what you already are. The garden is inside you now." Coleman left the tent without another word, heart hammering. Outside, Marcus was waiting. "What did they say?" Coleman shook his head. "Doesn't matter. We end this before that 8th generation ever sees daylight." The next day, they excavated more of the ruins, pulling out journals, ledgers, bones. Marcus worked tirelessly, decoding the language and symbols. "It all points to one thing," he said finally. "Ascension through flesh. Forced evolution." Coleman's jaw tightened. "Not ascension," he said. "Infection." Marcus didn't argue. "Either way," he said, "they believed it was their destiny, and they were almost done. One more generation, and they'd have spread beyond this county." Mike returned from a scouting run, carrying something wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, Coleman's blood ran cold. It was a growth, small, pulsing faintly, just like the one from the basement. "It's still alive," Mike said, his voice shaking. Marcus leaned close, studying it. "This is a fragment, a piece of the main mass. They must have been cultivating backups in case the original was destroyed." Coleman took a deep breath. "Then we burn every last piece. No backups, no survivors, no seeds. We finish what we started before it finishes us." He crushed the cigarette beneath his boot and turned toward the tree line. Somewhere beyond those trees, the missing cocoons were moving, carrying with them the fragments of a plan over a century in the making. Coleman knew this fight wouldn't end with fire. This was just the beginning. The night sky above Milbrook burned red, glowing from the fires still smoldering in the compound. Coleman stood near the trucks, shotgun hanging from his shoulder, knowing deep down this war had just begun. Mike approached, carrying fresh intel from the scouts. "We tracked 2 of them west," he said, pointing toward the hills. "But then the prints just stopped, like they walked straight into the ground." Coleman's jaw tightened. "Then they've gone to ground. We flush them out or bury them alive." He turned toward the team. "We load every thermite charge we've got. Tonight we hunt." They moved out under cover of darkness, trucks rumbling down narrow dirt roads. The forest felt alive, branches shifting above them as if unseen eyes watched every step. Coleman gripped the wheel, teeth clenched. At the first clearing, they found one of the missing cocoons. It had been split open from the inside. Blood trails led deeper into the woods, glowing faintly in the moonlight like molten metal. They followed cautiously, weapons raised until the sound reached them, the faint, wet shuffle of something moving just ahead. Coleman signaled silently. The men spread out, surrounding the clearing before stepping in. What they found made several agents curse aloud. A man knelt in the center, skin half-melted, bones elongated, his hand-feet fused into a tangle of roots gripping the soil. He was still breathing. Coleman approached slowly, rifle trained on the figure. The man's head snapped up, eyes glowing white. "Too late," he rasped. "The garden's awake." Then his chest ruptured and something crawled out. It was small, almost child-sized, but its limbs were wrong. Too many joints, too many fingers. It shrieked and bolted for the trees. Coleman fired, hitting it mid-leap. The thing twitched, then stilled. Mike grabbed a thermite charge and tossed it onto the corpse. Fire bloomed bright and white, consuming it instantly. The smell was unbearable, but Coleman forced himself to watch until nothing remained. "Burn them where they fall," he said grimly. "No more burial, no more bodies left behind. We're not giving them anything to grow back from." The men nodded, faces grim. They pressed on, deeper into the forest. The whispers returned, louder now, circling them. Coleman felt the sound inside his skull, like something rooting into his thoughts. He clenched his jaw and kept moving. The trail led them to an abandoned mine entrance, half collapsed but still passable. Faint light glowed from within. Coleman raised a fist, signaling silence. "This is it," he said. "We go in quiet. Come out fire." Inside, the air was damp and hot, walls coated in a thin layer of something organic, pulsing faintly. Threads ran along the ground, leading deeper, converging toward a central chamber. As they entered the main cavern, their lights illuminated the scene. Dozens of cocoons, fresh and glistening, hanging from the ceiling like grotesque fruit. Several were already split, their occupants gone. Coleman didn't hesitate. "Plant the charges," he ordered. "Everywhere." The men moved quickly, placing thermite around the perimeter. One of them froze suddenly, pointing. "Sheriff," he whispered, "we've got movement." From the shadows emerged several figures, taller than before, fully transformed. Their hand-feet clutched the walls, their limbs moving with insect-like precision. The glowing eyes fixed on the intruders, unblinking. The firefight erupted instantly, deafening in the confined space. Coleman fired until his rifle clicked empty, then drew his sidearm. The creatures moved fast, some dropping from the ceiling directly onto the men. Mike tackled one, jamming a knife into its throat before rolling clear. Blood sprayed the walls, glowing faintly. Coleman kicked another back and lobbed a thermite grenade, flames engulfing the corner of the cavern. The heat intensified, smoke filling the space. Coleman grabbed the detonator from his vest. "Fall back!" he shouted. "Everyone out now!" The men sprinted for the exit, bullets still flying. They burst into the night air just as the first explosion went off, a column of fire roaring skyward. The ground shook violently, the entire mine collapsing in on itself with a roar. Coleman stood panting, staring at the crater where the entrance had been. "That's one nest down," he said. "How many more?" No one answered. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Back at the compound, Marcus analyzed samples from the battlefield. "They're changing faster," he reported. "Adapting. The ones you fought tonight are stronger, faster, harder to kill. You triggered an evolutionary jump." Coleman swore. "So burning them made them worse?" Marcus shook his head. "Not worse. Closer to what they were trying to make. This was always part of the plan. Fire is a catalyst." Mike slammed his fist into the table. "Then what the hell do we do? If fire helps them, what's left?" Marcus looked grim. "Total eradication. No survivors, no spores, no remains." Coleman nodded slowly. "Then we go bigger. Thermite's just the start. If we have to level this whole forest, we do it." His voice was steady. "We end this on our terms." The next operation was larger. Trucks carrying barrels of thermite, drums of fuel, even shaped charges. Coleman oversaw every detail personally, knowing there was no room for mistakes this time. They struck at dawn, catching another nest just as its inhabitants were stirring. Explosions ripped through the earth, fire consuming everything. The screams were deafening, echoing through the hills like a chorus of agony. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained but ash and scorched stone. Coleman stood over the blackened ground, breathing hard. "That's two," he said, "but we're still not done." He turned toward the horizon. In the distance, the boys watched from the transport trucks, their glowing eyes unblinking. The oldest one smiled faintly as if amused. Coleman stared back, feeling a cold knot forming in his stomach. "We can burn every nest," he muttered to himself. "But until those kids stop glowing, this isn't over." The wind carried the smell of fire far into the forest, where unseen shapes stirred. Night fell again, the sky dark with smoke. Coleman sat by the fire with his shotgun across his knees, knowing the next battle would come soon, and it would be worse than anything before. Somewhere in the forest, the survivors regrouped. He could feel them like pressure behind his eyes. They weren't running anymore. They were coming. The war was far from over. The forest was silent again, but not with peace. Coleman felt it in his bones, a charged quiet, like the seconds before lightning strikes. Something out there was awake, and it was waiting. Mike joined him near the perimeter, face drawn, rifle slung tight. "Scouts didn't find anything," he said, voice tense. "No nests, no cocoons, no bodies. It's like they just vanished." Coleman stared into the dark tree line. "They didn't vanish. They're regrouping. They're not running anymore. They're planning." He spat into the dirt and racked his shotgun. "And we're not waiting for them to come to us." Federal reinforcements arrived by dawn. More trucks, heavier weapons, flamethrowers, and barrels of incendiary fuel. The compound became a war camp, men preparing for a siege none of them truly believed they'd survive. Marcus emerged from his tent with new data, his face pale. "The boys' vitals are spiking," he reported. "Their neural scans are lighting up like Christmas trees. Something's happening to them, something synchronized." Coleman marched to the medical tent. The boys were no longer sitting still. They stood in a perfect circle, eyes glowing brighter than before, skin slick with sweat. The oldest one spoke first. "You can't stop it now," he said, voice calm but resonant. "The 8th generation is rising. You burned the root, but the seed was planted long before you arrived." Coleman grabbed him by the collar, pulling him close. "Where?" he growled. The boy smiled faintly, unblinking. "Everywhere," he whispered. "In the trees, in the soil, in you. We are already growing." Before Coleman could respond, The ground trembled violently. Alarms blared across the camp as the earth split open near the tree line, roots bursting upward like skeletal fingers. Something was climbing out. The first figure emerged. Taller than the seventh generation. Skin bone white, glowing veins crawling beneath its surface. Its head turned toward the camp, eyes like hot coals. It opened its mouth and screamed. Dozens more followed, pulling themselves from the earth, their bodies slick with black fluid. They moved with perfect coordination, spreading out in a crescent to encircle the camp. Coleman raised his shotgun. Bullets tore through several, but even headshots only slowed them. Mike switched to grenades, the explosions tearing gaps in their ranks. Still they came, leaping over burning wreckage, shrieking in unison. Coleman grabbed the radio. "Detonate the outer ring!" The ground erupted as buried charges went off, ripping apart dozens of attackers. Smoke and blood filled the air, but the survivors only moved faster. Marcus shouted from behind him. "They're not just fighting. They're learning. Their movements are adapting with every kill." Coleman cursed and kept firing, retreating step by step toward the inner barricade. The battle raged for hours, fire and gunfire lighting the night. When dawn finally broke, the field outside the compound was a smoking graveyard, but several of the creatures had breached the perimeter. Coleman led a team through the wreckage, tracking glowing footprints. They found 2 bodies still twitching, their skins splitting, revealing something growing inside. Marcus stepped forward, horrified. "They're not dying. They're spawning." Coleman didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol and shot both creatures through the head. Then he ordered thermite on the remains. "No survivors," he said flatly. "Not one." Back in the camp, the boys were gone. Their restraints had been ripped apart as if by claws. Coleman followed the trail of glowing footprints to the edge of the forest. It ended there, abruptly. "They walked into the trees," Mike said quietly. Coleman nodded grimly, and the forest took them back. He turned toward the remaining men. "We hunt them down before they breed, whatever it takes." Marcus wiped soot from his face. "Even if we kill them all, the mutation could already be spreading. Spores, blood contact, air transmission, any of it could carry their code." Coleman loaded a fresh shell into his shotgun. "Then we take this whole place off the map. The forest, the soil, the roots, everything. No evidence left to grow back." By nightfall, the operation was set. Fuel trucks ringed the perimeter, charges placed in every remaining structure. Coleman stood with the detonator in hand, staring at the tree line one last time. In the distance, glowing eyes stared back at him. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The 8th generation was watching, waiting, unafraid. Coleman pressed the trigger. The world turned to fire. Flames consumed the compound, racing through the forest, turning night into day. The screams were deafening, rising and falling like a monstrous chorus. Coleman stood motionless until the last tree fell. When the fire finally died, nothing remained but ash and charred earth. The once living forest was a black wasteland. Coleman turned away, heart heavy. "It's done," he said, though he didn't believe it. Marcus joined him, staring at the smoking horizon. "If even one of them got out," he said quietly, "this starts all over again." Coleman nodded. "Then we keep hunting, until there's nothing left." Mike kicked at the ashes, frowning. "Feels like we just burned the future to save the present." Coleman didn't answer. The silence that followed was heavier than before, as if the forest still breathed. They packed up the camp and moved out, leaving nothing behind. As the convoy rolled away, Coleman looked back one last time. The ash shifted slightly, as though something moved beneath it. He tightened his grip on the wheel. This wasn't over. It might never be over. The 8th generation had risen, and somewhere, somehow, it was still growing.